On July 11, 2001, in the small town of Dale, Indiana, 15-year-old Stacy Payne was tragically murdered by Roy Lee Ward. Ward knocked on her door, claiming to look for a lost dog. Once inside, he brutally attacked Stacy with a knife and dumbbell, ending her young life in a violent and senseless act. This is one of the most horrific death row inmates executed in 2025. In this video, we'll walk you through the entire crime, the trial, and the execution itself. But before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and allows me to bring you more stories like this. Roy Lee Ward had a history of troubling behavior long before the crime. He had been involved in indecent exposure and other sexually inappropriate acts, signaling serious psychological issues. Despite multiple legal encounters, Ward's behavior was never fully addressed, and by 2001, he was on probation for a previous crime when he attacked Stacy. Stacy Payne, a 15-year-old honor student and cheerleader, was loved by her community and had a bright future ahead of her. She had no connection to Ward, who was simply a stranger. When he arrived at her home pretending to look for a lost dog, Stacy unknowingly let him inside, unaware of the danger he posed. Ward's motive wasn't about anger or a random outburst. It was about control. His past was filled with disturbing behavior that showed his growing need to dominate others. The attack on Stacy wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment. It was a result of his long-standing desire to assert power over someone he viewed as vulnerable. Ward's lack of empathy for Stacy and his indifference to her suffering revealed the depth of his psychological detachment. On the afternoon of July 11, 2001, Roy Lee Ward arrived at Stacy Payne's home in Dale, Indiana, claiming he was looking for a lost dog. Stacy, a 15-year-old honor student and cheerleader, answered the door, unaware of the danger lurking behind the innocent-sounding request. Once inside, Ward cut the phone lines, trapping Stacy inside with him and leaving her unable to call for help. Ward's actions were not impulsive. They were calculated. The way he isolated Stacy and controlled the situation from the very start highlights his psychological need for dominance. He didn't simply assault her in a moment of rage. His behavior was methodical, driven by a need to overpower someone weaker. The cutting of the phone lines, the use of multiple weapons, and the restraint of his victim showed a disturbing level of control. Ward then proceeded to violently assault Stacy, using both a knife and a dumbbell. The attack was brutal, and Stacy suffered severe injuries. Among the most serious was a deep wound to her throat, which left her struggling to breathe and fighting for her life. Despite the intensity of the assault, Stacy remained conscious for a period, trying to hold on as she pleaded for mercy. This act was not one of impulsive rage, but rather the culmination of Ward's long-standing psychological issues. His lack of empathy for Stacy's suffering and the cold, detached manner in which he carried out the attack speak to his deep psychological detachment. For him, Stacy wasn't a person with life, dreams, and a family. She was simply a target for him to control. Ward's psychological detachment allowed him to continue inflicting pain without any emotional reaction, revealing a sadistic need for control and dominance. As Stacy fought for her life, her younger sister, Melissa, who was upstairs, heard the screams and immediately called 911. When the police arrived, they found Ward standing in the doorway, covered in blood, with a knife still in his hand. He was arrested without resistance. Ward made no effort to flee, showing a chilling indifference to the crime he had just committed. His lack of remorse and the calmness with which he surrendered to authorities were early indicators of his psychological detachment from the reality of his actions. And Stacy was found unconscious and critically injured despite medical efforts. Stacy passed away shortly after from her injuries. As the case proceeded to trial, Ward's legal journey became a prolonged and complex process. In 2002, he was convicted and sentenced to death, but the conviction was later overturned by the Indiana Supreme Court in 2004 due to pretrial publicity. A new trial was ordered, but by the time it began in 2007, Ward pleaded guilty to the charges of rape and murder, accepting responsibility for his actions. This was seen as an attempt to avoid another lengthy trial, but also as an acknowledgement of his deep-seated psychological issues. Throughout the legal proceedings, Ward's defense team argued that he had a history of mental illness, including a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. His attorney suggested that his social and emotional impairments may have influenced how he acted during the attack. However, the prosecution countered that Ward's actions were not the result of mental illness, but were instead driven by a sadistic need for control and his complete lack of empathy for the victim. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury once again sentenced Ward to death, citing the brutality of the crime and a lack of remorse shown by Ward. Throughout this period, his psychopathic tendencies became more evident. Even after conviction, Ward maintained an emotionally detached stance, rarely showing any true regret for what he had done. His psychological makeup suggested that for him, the crime was an act asserting control rather than the result of an emotional outburst. After years of legal challenges and delays, Roy Lee Ward was finally executed on October 10, 2025, marking the end of a long legal battle. At 12:01 a.m., he was brought to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, where he was executed by lethal injection. This marked the conclusion of a process that had taken over 2 decades of appeals, court reviews, and denied clemency requests. Ward's final meal was from Texas Corral, consisting of a hamburger, steak melt, French fries, baked potato with butter, 12 fried shrimp, a sweet potato, chicken Alfredo, and breadsticks, a relatively lavish request compared to the gravity of the crimes he committed. His final words, according to officials, were simply, "Brian is going to read them," referring to his spiritual advisor, Deacon Brian Nosebush, who was present during the execution. As the lethal injection was administered, Ward's reaction was calm and almost indifferent. His hand turned blue, and within moments, he was pronounced dead at 12:33 a.m. His physical reaction, or lack of it, was a stark contrast to what one might expect in such a moment. Ward's lack of emotional distress in his final moments mirrored the psychological detachment he had displayed throughout the entire process. For the family of Stacy Payne, decades of grief and uncertainty finally met a grim sense of closure.
There is a quote that says, "Time heals all wounds," but that absolutely is not true in this case.
Her mother, Julie Winninger, described the years since Stacy's death as filled with emotional devastation, where family gatherings and holidays were reminders of the life they lost. When news of Ward's execution came, it was met with a mixture of relief and lingering sorrow. Though justice had been served, the absence of Stacy could never be replaced. During the execution, a small group of anti-death penalty activists gathered outside the prison, reading scriptures and ringing bells in silent protest. Inside, only a few family members and legal representatives were permitted. For Stacy's family, witnessing Ward's final moments was a powerful and emotional experience, not of vengeance, but of acknowledging the end of a long legal struggle and the fulfillment of the justice system. From a psychological perspective, Ward's detachment and lack of visible remorse likely compounded the family's pain. For someone like him, empathy is absent, so he could face the end of his life without understanding or feeling the depth of suffering he caused. This emotional void, consistent throughout his life, made Stacy's family confrontation with him emotionally complex. They faced the knowledge that the person responsible for their loss had never truly recognized the human impact of his actions. The calm and calculated demeanor that Ward had shown during the execution only underscored the cold, detached nature of the individual they had spent years pursuing through the courts, making the experience emotionally intense but meaningful. This concludes the story of Roy Lee Ward and the tragic case of Stacy Payne. From the crime to the execution, we've explored the events, the legal journey, and the psychological forces that shaped this case. While justice was ultimately carried out, the impact on the victim's family and community serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence. If this story gave you insight into true crime, human psychology, or the justice system, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos. Share your thoughts, and let us know what lessons you take from cases like this. Thank you for watching.